Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here today. My name is Kara McDonald, and I'm the Senior Director of Philanthropy and Plan Giving at the Seattle Public Library Foundation. We are proud to host this webinar series in partnership with the King County Library System Foundation. And I know we also have friends joining us today from Snow Isle Libraries Foundation and Pierce County Library Foundation. So wherever you are joining us from, I hope you know how grateful we are that you support your public libraries. I have a few quick things before our presentation begins today. First, we are recording this session, and you will receive a link to the recording and slides after we wrap up. Our speakers are going to have time for your questions at the end of their presentation today. So I'll come back on screen and help facilitate those on your behalf. And if you think of a question that you want to ask at any point while the presentation is happening, please be sure to use the Q&A box, not the chat, to make sure that we'll see it and that we can ask it for you. And if you see a question that you'd especially like answered or that you've been wondering about yourself in the Q&A box, use the little thumbs up button next to it to upvote it. I'm going to be sorting the questions by your upvotes. So the ones with the most votes are what I'll be asking our speakers first. And we'll get through as many of your questions as we can with the time that is allowed. And finally, when you sign off today, you'll be prompted to take a very short survey about your experience. I hope you'll take a few minutes to complete this. It's only 5 questions, and it really, really does help us shape our future webinars and the topics that we are presenting in these. And to sweeten the deal, anyone who completes a survey will be entered into a drawing to win raffle prizes, which could be some library swag, maybe some books. It's all good stuff. So please take a few minutes to complete that. I'm now going to invite our speakers, Katie Mars and Lisa Mayfield, to join me on screen. Hello. Katie is an attorney whose practice focuses on disability and elder law. And Lisa is a founder of Aging Wisdom, an aging life care center here in Seattle. And if you've been participating in these webinars for a while, you might recall that Lisa was one of our very early presenters in this series way back in 2021. We are thrilled to have her back with us today, along with Katie. And I know I'm really looking forward to hearing what they have to share about taking control of our aging journeys. And I'm just really grateful to both of you for your time today. So Lisa and Katie, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Kara. Okay, we're getting our PowerPoint set up, and I think we're all up and ready to go. I'm Katie, again, attorney from Brothers and Henderson. I'm so excited to be with you all today, and thank you for spending your time with us. We're going to start today by talking a little bit about some of the basic legal documents that I at least feel that everyone should have and are helpful for you in taking control of your own aging journey and ensuring that you have a guidelines for the people who might be making decisions for you in case you're not able to make decisions for yourself, and trying to make sure that you know you can have some control over what's going to happen down the road. Lisa, would you mind going to the next slide? We might be stuck. There we go. So the basic documents that I talk to all my clients about are the durable power of attorney for finances and healthcare first and foremost. This is a document, or both these documents, I think are important no matter what age you are from 18 and up, because none of us have a crystal ball or have any way of knowing what may happen to us in the future. What these documents do is if you're ever in a situation where you're unable to make healthcare decisions or manage your finances, that you have a trusted individual that you have appointed in advance who's able to make those decisions for you. Now, for finances, that will give your agent the ability to access your accounts, your bank accounts, your retirement accounts, to be able to pay your bills, to do your taxes, if your house needs to be sold. And then above and beyond, there's additional powers that you can decide that your agent can have, like gifting your assets to charity during your lifetime or to your children or their family members if that's what you want them to do. So that document is really controlling who and how your finances are going to be controlled and who's going to be the one making those decisions for you. For healthcare decisions, that's if you're unable to make decisions for yourself regarding your health care. If your doctor feels that you're unable to communicate what your desires are, whether that's consenting to a surgery or where you should be receiving your long-term care, if you're unable to do so, then your agent, the person that you've chosen in this power of attorney document, is the one that makes those decisions for you. An advance directive is something that you may have heard reference as a living will. It also sometimes is misconstrued as a post, which we'll talk a little bit later about how those are different. But in general, putting down in writing what you would want for certain end-of-life decisions or other care decisions, if you're unable to make those for yourself, you can think of it as a guideline for your power of attorney for healthcare decisions on how you want to be cared for. The will and trust are ones that you hear a lot. And oftentimes I have folks coming to me saying their biggest question is, should I have a will? Should I have a trust? A lot of people have heard that there's a magic trust that will resolve all their issues as far as avoiding probate, avoiding taxes, and making sure everything happens the way they want to. And unfortunately, my answer to folks is there is no magic document, period, about anything. And so whether you have a will or a trust, or whether you don't need either document, is really specifically tailored to your situation. And you see a bunch of bullets on the screen. And that's just to help you understand that there's a lot of different factors. And while we all think, most people think that their situation is really simple and straightforward, you still probably have factors that may or may not make it more complicated, but at least may put you in one bucket or another as far as what your ultimate estate plan should entail. So the first is Washington state intestacy laws. So those are the laws that control what happens to your assets if you're to pass away without a will, without a trust, without any estate planning or beneficiary designations. You can think of it primarily as your family tree. So going to your spouse, your children, your parents, your siblings, and kind of branching out. There are really specific rules for what happened, where your assets go, and how they're divided if you don't do any estate plan. But I think that's always a really important place for people to start to understand, if I do nothing, what's going to happen? Do I agree with that? And is that fine? And for a lot of folks, it is. If they just want their assets to go to their spouse or to be split equally amongst their two kids, intestacy is, a fine way to go. If that's not how you want things to go, if you have some bitter resentments for the family, or let's say you have charities or organizations that you're really passionate about and you really want to support through your estate planning, then you need to take really specific actions to make sure that things happen the way you want to. Beneficiary designations can come into play. They pull your assets outside of a trust or the control of a trust or a will, potentially, because you have a contract with your financial institution saying where something's going to go. So a beneficiary designation on your actual bank account or your life insurance policy, etc. How your real property is titled can control what happens with your assets. You might have a transfer on death deed. You might have a joint with right of survivorship on the title of your property that controls outside of a will or a trust. You might have beneficiaries who need additional support, may have disabilities or have had some trouble launching, that you decide that a trust would be really helpful for you to provide some parameters for how the money is going to be used for them, so that you can provide some sort of support that's not just handing them a bunch of money and waiting to see what they do with it. A lot of people, you want to plan for a blended family or family conflicts to try to avoid conflict in the future and to make sure that you're not creating a problem when you pass, and there's confusion or a lack of clarity as far as what you wanted to happen. If you have a taxable estate, whether that's for Washington standards or federal standards, that's going to impact your planning, whether you care about avoiding probate or not. For any of you who may have lived in California at any point in your life, I'm sure you've been told over and over you have to have a trust to avoid probate. the really interesting thing about living in the United States is every state is very different, and Washington probate is very, very different than California probate. And here, Washington probate is quite frequently less expensive than actually setting up a trust and fully funding it and making sure that it stays fully funded your entire life until you pass, which is just kind of an interesting thing to think about as far as what is actually going to save you money and be most efficient for you. Whether you have a business also comes into play, whether that needs to be additional estate planning or actually in the documents related to your business of what happens. And then finally, the laws of Washington, whether you need a probate or not, if you have less than $100,000 in all cash, there's the small estate affidavit, which is a completely different route than a lot of people think about or know exist. So overall, we have a system here in Washington that works differently depending on what your individual situation is. And it's really important to really think about what those various factors are when you're making your estate plan, as well as how those factors change over time. Your assets today may be very different from what your assets look like when you pass away. And so what you need to do to control where things go and what your family looks like, your recipients may be minors today and you need a trust to protect them. And when you pass, they could be 40 years old and you have no problem with that money going directly to them. So it's really important to really understand what your specific situation is and remember that when you get advice from other people who say, you know, this is how I did it, this is the way to go, remember that their situation may be different and you really want a plan that fits your family, your assets, your needs, and your goals. All right, Lisa, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Katie. And I was thinking of this last week. I was actually in Minneapolis and I had the opportunity to tour the singer Prince's estate, Paisley Park. And I was thinking about this presentation because people may or may not remember that Prince died without a will. And I suspect most people joining us today don't have the 152 million that Prince died with. However, it's a perfect example of what happens if you don't actually do your will. He died in 2016 and 2024, they are still battling out his estate. So I suspect people will listen to this presentation or have listened to similar presentations in the past and have it on their to-do list to meet with an attorney to do these documents. But life gets in the way, and more often than not, we see people not actually getting these documents in order. So use Prince as your motivator to actually meet with an attorney to get these documents done. So I am Lisa Mayfield, and I'm with Aging Wisdom, and I'm a care consultant, and I help people navigate care decisions. And I am having a little trouble navigate. There we go. So we are glad that you are all here because statistically, stats show us that 70% of people over 65 will eventually need some sort of help in their lifetime. So basically, most all of us here today will need some care when we're older. And if you happen to have a spouse or a partner, the stats, pretty significant that one of you will need help over time. So I would love people to come with the kind of mindset that someday you will need help. And this presentation is about helping you create that plan for the day that you do need help. And then I hope that you are part of the 30% that never need that help. But if you have that plan in place, that is really how you take control of your aging journey. So one of the first questions people often ask when they're thinking about planning ahead for aging is, should I stay in my home or should I think about moving? People might know that their neighbors are moving into a retirement community, so it makes them wonder, should we move into a retirement community? Or they might think, I never want to move into a retirement community. Can I stay at home? And you certainly can stay at home, and we'll talk about that. But I think it's important for people to think about just the home in a pretty global way and thinking about where you live and trying to think about some of the challenges that your home may present over time as you start to be less mobile, as you start to have less motivation to take care of your home and your yard. And so the first thing I think people should think about is just navigating your home. In particular, how many steps do you have? How many steps do you have up to your home? How many steps might you have into your garage if you have a garage to get to your car? I think it can be helpful to think about, what is it like to navigate your yard? What does it take to take your garbage out? What path do you have to take to navigate the garbage each week when you're taking that out? And also thinking about, if you had caregivers coming into your home, is there room for somebody else in your home? If you have a spouse or partner and one of you needs assistance and you have a caregiver providing that extra support, do you have room for that third person in your home? What would it be like to have somebody in your space? So really just thinking about navigating your home. I think the other is thinking about home repair and yard maintenance. I've been meeting with many people recently who think about the deferred maintenance on their home. They've lived in their home for 30 years or more and haven't necessarily kept up on all the maintenance that needs to be done. And so when they're thinking about staying at home or moving, they're thinking about the cost that it might take to actually bring their house up to date with maintenance. You might think about your yard and the size of your yard, and maybe you're somebody that really enjoys being in your yard and your garden. But over time, people often lose interest and motivation to take care of the yard or to take care of a big house. Your energy levels might be less. You also might have different priorities. You might want to be spending more time with your grandchildren, or more time reading your books, or more time volunteering, or spending time traveling. And so you might have enjoyed that time in your yard at one point, but over time, maybe you have less interest in that. So thinking about the overall maintenance and the yard. And then with COVID, it really taught us the danger of social isolation and not connecting with others and being around others. So people often will have a desire to stay at home, but they neglect to think about, what will it be like if you're not able to get out and about the way you do now? Will you be able to keep those social relationships, or will you start to be isolated at home? How would you keep those connections? And if at some point in time you're not able to drive, because often there's a point in time when people need to retire from driving, how will you get around? How will you get your hair done? How will you get your groceries? How would you get to your book club, your local library? It's just thinking about the transportation. And those joining us from King County, if you're in the Seattle Bellevue area, we're very fortunate to have a lot of options for transportation. But those of you joining us from more rural areas, transportation can be a real issue. So thinking through those challenges and how you would adapt to them, I think, is really important. But when you need help, you can get it at home and you can age in place. And I will talk about that next. I think, Katie, you were going to talk about kind of how you pick a power of attorney in your legal documents.
Yeah, so the most important part of these durable power of attorney documents for healthcare and finances that I did a brief overview of is who you choose as your agent. And I'm going to start with I saw a couple questions in the chat that I was planning on answer, but I'll start with those. For a lot of people, or for folks who are married, you think about decision making. The first person you think about for decision making for you is likely your spouse, and that's perfectly fine for your spouse to be your agent. And there are certain decisions that your spouse can make for you without having a power of attorney, but there's always a ceiling. So when it comes to finances, if you and your spouse jointly own assets, so let's say a jointly owned checking account, even if you lose the ability to really manage that account, your spouse is a co-owner and would still be able to use that account to pay for bills and put money into it, etc. but they wouldn't necessarily be able to access your retirement accounts because they're not an owner. They also wouldn't be able to talk to Social Security or the institution that runs your pension. So there's a ceiling as far as what decisions they could make. They also wouldn't be able, if you're co-owners on your house, they wouldn't be able to sell your house without your signature and approval without a power of attorney. For healthcare, your spouse frequently, if you're in the hospital and you're unable to make a decision like consent to surgery, your spouse is able to do that for you. But for most people, your spouse is aging along a similar pace as you are. And so what I really recommend is, even if you have your spouse as your first agent, to be thinking about contingency plans. So having somebody as a backup and having a backup to your backup, so that you can try to make these documents last as long as they can. I have folks who come and see me all the time, and they had a power of attorney for 10 years ago, and they maybe had one agent, and now that agent is passed or is no longer able to serve in this role. And so I really want this document, I don't want you to have to come and see me all the time to update this document. It's not something you wake up thinking, oh my gosh, I need to update my power of attorney again. It's something you'd like to do once and hopefully have it last as long as it can before you need to do it again. So really having those backups is a way that you can ensure the longevity of this document. And then as far as the success of this document, making sure that your agent is somebody that you trust and who is able to make, is responsible enough to make the decisions in your best interest, but also knows you well enough to think about what decisions you would make if you were able to make them. So it's not just what seems like a responsible choice or overall seems like a good choice for somebody. It's what are good choices for you, because all of us, our care, how we spend our money is really individualized for us and what we care about. And you want somebody who's really going to be putting you first and thinking about, how do I manage this in a way that I feel that they would agree with and want me to do so. Because it really is about you at the end of the day, and not necessarily what they would want for themselves. For end of life decision making, and what happens for you, for some of us, I always tell people kind of the best way to go would be you're in complete control of your life, making all of your own decisions, until one night, you have ice cream, you go to bed, and you pass away in your sleep. And I have known a few folks who that has happened for them, and I love that for them, but that's not necessarily going to be how it goes for all of us. And the way that you can try to have some control over what happens, even if you lose the capacity to make those decisions for yourself, is one, choosing agents that you really trust and are going to do things, like I said, according to your wishes. But also really communicating your wishes as far as, if I have dementia, I want to live in my home and I want caregivers to come into my home. Or I would feel more comfortable if I moved into a memory care facility. And those are options that Lisa is going to talk about some more. But really thinking about, where would I feel most comfortable if I was in this situation? These different health scenarios, what kind of care would I want to receive? What are my priorities for quality of life? How do I want my money to be spent? So there's a lot of decisions that somebody's going to have to make, whether it's you or the people that you appoint. So right now, and on an ongoing basis, really thinking about what you would want and talking to your agents, whether it's your spouse, your children, a friend, or a professional, which we'll talk about later, but really communicating to them how you feel about these things so that they can have some sort of guidepost if they get to those decisions. Oh, I remember Katie talked to me about this, and this is how she feels, so I'm going to try to follow what I think she would want to do. You also want to try to put this in writing, an advance directive and a post. And those two documents, one is for your physician to sign, the post, and one is more of a legal document, the advance directive. The big difference is emergency responders are going to look for that bright green post form in your apartment if you have a heart attack, and they're going to follow that. They're not going to follow an advance directive. They don't care. But the advance directive is going to be a really good guideline for your power of attorney for healthcare decisions. Let's say if you're in a hospital or they're deciding where you're going to get care or treatment, for them to be able to make decisions in accordance with your wishes. All right, Lisa, you go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Katie. And you'll see I'm kind of a crazy slide lady. So my apologies for the technology challenge. So our next slide is talking about if you were to move, what options are available for you to choose from. And understanding retirement community options is really complicated and confusing. When I said that 70% of us would need help at some point in our life, the typical things that we see people needing help with, because I think at first it helps to understand what would you even need help with, and then deciding who would be the person that will help me with these tasks. Sometimes it might be your spouse or partner, sometimes it might be a neighbor or adult children, but these are the tasks that people will often need help with. One is managing medications, remembering to take medications, oftentimes help making meals, whether people lose the desire to make their own meals or lose interest in making meals, are not eating nutritious meals, needing some sort of help with meals is a task we see often. Helping with bill paying, we'll often see people having difficulty managing their mail and therefore managing their bills. So somebody to help with the day-to-day finances. I mentioned earlier transportation. If you do have to retire from driving, how will you get around? We talked about isolation and loneliness. Who will provide some companionship and engage your brain? And then as mobility starts to decline, just needing somebody around for some oversight or fall prevention. If your memory isn't working as well as it used to, you often might just need someone around to help you with problem solving. Eventually, people might need help with more physical tasks, with dressing or showering. And another gap we often see is people needing help navigating the medical system and scheduling appointments and going to doctor's appointments and making sure the doctors understand what you're having challenges with, why you're there. And then somebody that can kind of be the second set of ears. What did the doctor say? What did they recommend? What were the next steps? And that can help you follow through with those instructions from the doctor. So those are often what people need help with. And you can get help if you're hiring outside help. You can have caregivers come into your home. So when we talk about aging in place, if you decide your home is a good fit for you to age in place, you can engage and hire caregivers to come into your home to help with many of those tasks. Or there's other professionals that can help with some of the pieces that caregivers don't do, such as meals or bill paying. Caregivers can be hired kind of by the hour for a certain amount of time, either a little bit of time or round the clock. So that's how people will get help in the home. If you decide that being at home isn't the right fit for you, either your house isn't a good setup or you would thrive in a more social setting, or you don't have other people to kind of manage your life in your house, then moving might make sense. And what community is right for people really depends primarily on when people decide to move. Do you move proactively, so you're moving when you're still independent and healthy and you don't need assistance? Or do you stay at home for as long as you can and move when you actually need help? That kind of decision really drives what retirement community option or category is the right fit for you. These kind of 4 columns represent the 4 kind of categories of retirement communities out there. There are independent living communities where people can move almost like a condo building and receive some light services, but mostly they're independent. And in these communities, you would have your own room. You would often have your own kitchen, your own bathroom. You can have the size of your unit will vary on how much you're willing to spend. Do you have a studio? Do you have a 2-bedroom? And it functions very much like a condo or an apartment. And then in these independent communities, they'll often provide meals. So you can go to the dining room and have your meals prepared for you. They'll often have activities where they're engaging you socially, engaging your brain, you're around other people. They'll often provide transportation either for tours, activities, social, or going to doctor's appointments in a radius around that community. They'll often provide some light housekeeping as well. When you start to actually need assistance with some of those tasks that I mentioned, assisted living becomes a more appropriate option. And that's where your own unit is very much like I described for independent living. The difference is that there's actually caregivers on site who can come in and perform some of those activities that we talked about, whether helping you with your medications, reminding you to go to meals, helping you with dressing or showering. So in assisted living communities, very much like independent living, but that additional caregiver support is available to you. So that's kind of a different category of option. And a third category is memory care, which is very much like I described for independent and assisted living. The primary difference is the area is usually smaller. It's often secured, meaning people can't wander out of that area. The staff to resident ratio is higher. The activities are geared towards people with memory issues. I also think it's helpful to note that just because someone has memory issues doesn't always mean they need memory care. Many of the assisted living communities are quite used to helping people with dementia, and people can live in assisted living. Oftentimes it's when people have a more significant needs for memory challenges that memory care would be more appropriate. And then the fourth option or category is skilled nursing. You might hear of that's kind of known as several names: a nursing home, rehab, skilled nursing. Those are communities where, if you had family members in congregate living at one point in time, maybe it was your grandmother, you probably were in a nursing home. So people, when we talk about retirement communities, people often visualize that, where it's a much more hospitalized setting. In the old days, they weren't always the most pleasant places. They often didn't smell great. They often had people in the hallways that were screaming out. If you've been to a skilled nursing more recently, they're very different than what you might recall. They're lovely communities, still very more hospital-like setting, and they provide a significant amount of care. Most people are in skilled nursing or rehab for a short period of time following a hospitalization. If somebody had a stroke or somebody had a fall, they'll often go to rehab for some extra TLC and physical therapy and occupational therapy, and then they'll move to a new setting from there. So kind of a short-term stop. And then there's an option called adult family homes. And those are homes in the community. You might have one in your neighborhood and not even know it. And they're licensed to provide the same level of care as skilled nursing. There's typically 6 residents in an adult family home, and they're often a terrific resource when people need a significant amount of help. So each of these columns sort of represent from no help to a lot of help on a continuum. And then lastly, there's an option called Continuing Care Retirement Community, or CCRC. And those are one-stop shopping options where you'll have maybe all of these in one campus. So they'll often be independent living, they'll have assisted living on site, they'll have memory care, and some have skilled nursing. I will say that these days, fewer and fewer have skilled nursing available in that continuum, but that's a campus where all levels are in one place. And again, when you decide, well, how would I ever know which option is best for me? It's really based on how much care you need at the time of moving. If you're somebody moving proactively, like I mentioned earlier, you're independent, you're still fairly young, you're active, you don't need help, that kind of one-stop shopping model is likely a good option for you because they're really geared towards people who are independent. If you've waited and you already need assistance, then that option is likely not a good choice for you anymore. And that's when an assisted living community is probably a better fit. So it's a very complicated question, and it depends on a lot of variables: how much help you need, how much money you have, what your preferences are, how fancy you want a community, how casual. So it's really difficult to kind of, if somebody said to me, where should I move? Those would be all the variables I would ask you about. But this is a general guideline of what the different options and categories are that are out there. And then I think, Katie, you are next.
So now we're going to talk about choosing your agent when you don't have, under a power of attorney or your executor under a will or a trustee for a trust, when you don't necessarily have a family member or friend that you think would serve in this role appropriately. So for a lot of folks, for whatever reason, maybe you have one person that could serve and you don't necessarily have backups, or there's nobody that you want to necessarily burden with the responsibility of these roles. They turn to professionals. And so there's professional fiduciaries who are able to serve as your power of attorney, as the executor under your will, or as a trustee. And choosing those is really, I would say, a personal journey. A lot of people come to me and they want referrals, and I'm very happy to give those. But then I always have people go back and actually interview the professionals to determine whether they're a good fit for them. Because I have a good working relationship with the professional, or I have other clients who have had good experiences, doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily meet your specific needs. So some things that I tell people to ask is the range of services. So there may be professionals who are really well suited to high net worth estates, and maybe they don't really work with estates that are below a certain limit. Or there are those who are really focused on making financial decisions, but don't want to serve in the role as a power of attorney for healthcare decisions, that's maybe outside of their scope. So you want to think about, what do they actually do? And then what do they outsource? So there are professionals who will serve as the power of attorney for healthcare decisions, but they will hire a care manager who is more attuned with what the healthcare needs are, can understand maybe better what the medical professionals are stating, and then they give their recommendation to the professional as far as what the decision should be. Or they outsource the CPA. Maybe they have a CPA that works for them, or they outsource so that somebody else is taking care of the taxes. And then you're thinking, or for investment purposes. And so you're thinking about, what are the charges that this professional is charging? And then what are the other professionals that maybe they have to hire to accomplish their role, and who else is charging and what their rates are. You also want to make sure that this professional is going to be around for the time period that you're looking. If you're wanting somebody that maybe in 30 years from now is able to make decisions for you or for your estate, you want them to be around, or you want them to have a succession plan so that their business is still around, so that you're not left in the lurch and there's nobody able to serve in this role. So that's one thing you also want to ask about, as far as what is their planning for succession as you're planning for your own succession. You also want to get an idea of what their costs are. Most professionals will have hourly rates, and oftentimes they break down their hourly rates based off the type of work. So if they're opening and sorting your mail, they might bill that at a lower rate, versus if they're doing more complicated investment strategy, that would probably be at a higher hourly rate. So you want to know what that breakdown is, so that you can understand in general, what is this going to cost you or your estate. Another area that you really want to see what their expertise are if you're, let's say, choosing a trustee for a trust for, I'm going to mention the child that's kind of failure to launch again, maybe somebody who's had some issues with drugs or other kind of more irresponsible behavior, who's not going to be super happy that there's somebody between them and what their inheritance is. So does that professional have the expertise to be able to deal kindly but firmly and professionally with that family member or beneficiary. Or if you have a family member or beneficiary that's disabled, are they going to be able to appropriately understand what that person's specific needs are and how they can best use the funds to support them and their quality of life or their goals of independence? You really want to think about what are the scenarios that you think your professional maybe is going to have to deal with, and what is their experience with managing those different factors to make sure that they're actually a good fit for you. Okay, Lisa, I think you are talking, beginning the conversation about costs that people should be prepared for as they age.
Yes, so this is where I am the bearer of bad news, and I'm grateful to be on Zoom so you can't kick me when you're upset with the information about finances. So we talked about it, 70% of people will need care someday. We kind of talked about what that care might look like. And then we talked about the different ways you can get that care, whether you be hiring a caregiver or whether you consider moving. And this graph is meant to talk to you about what are these costs. I will say that my graph is based on King County costs, primarily Seattle, Bellevue. Wherever you're living, if you're in a city, the costs are going to be higher than if you're out of a city. So those of you out of King County or even a little bit kind of out of Seattle, Bellevue, the costs are often significantly lower. So I will give you that caveat. And this slide is really meant to kind of show you a comparison of what costs are the most and what costs are the least. So you'll see the graph with the highest cost. That is having caregivers in your home 24/7. So if there was ever a time when you needed caregivers round the clock, that is actually the most expensive option of all the options for getting care. In Seattle right now, on a monthly basis, care around the clock with caregivers in your home is around $20,000 a month, and I will say often a little higher. So on an annual basis, it's close to $250,000 for caregivers in your home around the clock. I will say if people have a spouse or partner, that partner is often providing much of that 24/7 care. So it's often unusual that somebody with somebody else in their home would need round the clock care. And I also will say the caveat that it's pretty unusual you go from needing no help to 24-hour care. So I know that number can be scary, but also know that it's like the highest level of care somebody needs. The lowest option for care is the first column, and that's for having caregivers in the home for a little bit of time. We use the 40 hours a week as a guide. That's what if you had caregivers during the day, how much would that cost? And it looks like we're saying around $75,000 a month. Caregivers charged by the hour, and the hourly rates are, I'm going to say 25 at the low end, but that's probably pretty hard to find $25 an hour right now, up to $75 an hour or higher. The cost will range on how much caregiving you have. Do you have a little bit of caregiving or do you have a lot? The fewer hours you have a caregiver, the higher hourly rate. And most people start with a little bit of help. You might have somebody come in for 3-4 hours a day, maybe once a week, and that might increase gradually over time. So initially, the costs are not nearly as high as we're showing in this graph. And then for the third column is assisted living. When we talked, if you are going to move into a retirement community and you already need some help, what might that cost? And that's a pretty hard number to give because this number varies greatly from community to community and brand to brand. But we're giving an average of $8,000 to $10,000 a month when people are in assisted living needing care already. If you're in independent living and not needing care, those costs will be a little bit less. Memory care is often a bit more. We did an average of $14,000 a month. And then an adult family home in kind of the Seattle Bellevue area is averaging $8,000 to $10,000 a month. And remember that the further out you get from the Seattle Bellevue area, the costs will start to decrease fairly significantly. I will say that Genworth Financial, if you Google search Genworth, they have a great long-term care estimator where you can put in your zip code and they will show you the costs in your area. So if your parent lives, do you live somewhere else, or maybe you have a parent in another area, you can look at costs on Genworth, and that's a great resource. I will say that we find that they underestimate the cost pretty significantly, but it certainly gives you a ballpark to have in mind. And people will often say, okay, wow, these costs are pretty high. How do we pay for these costs? And in general, they're private pay resources. So having caregivers in your home or moving into a retirement community, you are paying privately. People will often believe that Medicare will cover these costs, and unfortunately, that's not true. I think the easiest way to think about it is Medicare is a health insurance. So Medicare pays for what health insurance pays. It's your health insurance. And then there's some unique situations where Medicare will pay. They will pay, when I talked about being in skilled nursing or rehab following a hospitalization, so somebody that might have had a stroke or a fall and need a little bit extra therapy and TLC, Medicare may pay for a short-term rehab stay. Following a hospitalization, they may pay for an occupational therapist or physical therapist to come to your home for a short time, but those are the few times the Medicare will kick in. If you're fortunate enough to have a long-term care insurance policy, long-term care insurance pays for caregivers in your home or care at a retirement community. There's a reverse mortgage as an option. Some people look at pulling out the value of their home if you've lived there a long time in your home. And then if you have a little bit of money, or your family members do, that's when not Medicare, but Medicaid will kick in. And Katie will explain that a little bit more. I wanted to back up because I forgot to mention when we're talking about retirement communities, there's 3 costs to a retirement community, and I like to point that out. You'll have your monthly rent, so paying for your apartment and the basic services they provide. I talked about meals and transportation and activities. And once you need care, once you need some caregiving support, there'll be additional costs on top of your rent. And then each community you tour will have a one-time payment. It might be called a deposit, it might be called a community fee, and that will be kind of the first amount you'll pay, and then your monthly rent. I mention that because when people tour, you'll often be told the monthly rent, which can often sound like a good number, and the facilities might forget to tell you that once you start to need help, there'll be additional costs on top of that rent. So I think it's really important for people to know that care will cost more and to ask about that. How much will care cost? What's the most it might cost? What's the average it will cost? Because you know your fees will escalate over time as you start to need more help. And then I will also, my last thing I'll say is, no matter how much money somebody has or how little money somebody has, there's always a plan that can be made for you. So there's hope that if you work with professionals, there can always be a plan no matter how much resources that you have. And I think Katie will then talk about finances.
All right, so I have this cartoon that I just kind of love, just to lighten the subject, because I know that Lisa had to kind of hit us over the head with a hammer with the cost of long-term care. But we'll start out kind of picking up from where Lisa said the difference between Medicare and Medicaid. Like Lisa said, oftentimes people think that Medicare is going to pay for long-term care. And my little trick, because of course the government, we have 2 names that are very similar and are really easy to confuse. I always tell people Medicare, think of health care. So it really is your health insurance. And Medicaid, think of aid as in financial aid. So that's where it kicks in for long-term care when you don't have the resources to pay. So in general, Medicaid started out as a federal program. It's run by the states, and we have some really great waivers in Washington, which is allowances that state has gotten from the federal government to expand Medicaid. So traditionally, Medicaid was always in skilled nursing facilities, but in Washington, we have access to Medicaid in assisted living communities, in adult family homes, and some limited Medicaid in your home. There's some different rules between all of these different situations for Medicaid, but it's important to know that there are some various access points. For the assisted living and the adult family home, I think the most important thing for you to know now is that quite frequently there are what are called private pay periods. And what that means are the businesses that run assisted living or adult family homes, they get to choose whether to opt in for Medicaid. So they choose whether or not they contract with the state to allow Medicaid recipients in their facility. They will get paid less for somebody on Medicaid than somebody who's being paid or paying privately, sorry. And so for them, they kind of do their business calculations and say, okay, we'll allow you to go on Medicaid after you pay privately for X amount of time. And you can think of it similarly to life insurance, that you're paying premiums and the company is thinking about, okay, how can we get our money and get more money than what we ultimately pay out? So the assisted living and adult family homes are thinking, how can we make sure that we at least get X amount of money? And hopefully that ends up being more for us in the long run than the price cut that we're taking by allowing people to be on Medicaid. Private pay periods vary greatly depending on whether you're looking at assisted living or adult family home, whether you're closer to a city like Seattle or farther out. So it's really important to do some research in your area to understand what the options are. So for adult family homes, I would say there are more adult family homes that will accept Medicaid than there are assisted living facilities that accept Medicaid. Of those that accept it, again, you want to know, how long do I have to pay your private rates before I can go on Medicaid? I mean, they might not make that information really obvious and available to you because they don't really want you to be on Medicaid if they had their choice of the matter. But you want to find out, because you can do some math on your own to figure out, okay, if I'm paying privately within this range for X amount of time, how much money am I going to be spending from my own assets before I could even potentially be eligible for Medicaid? And that's going to help you understand maybe when you're moving to such a facility or home versus staying in your home. Because if you spend down your funds, let's say on in-home caregivers before you ever move out of your home, and you've spent the money that could have been used for a private pay period, then your options for where you can move might be more limited because you're looking at places that accept Medicaid right away, which just kind of closes some doors for you, which might work for you in your area, or if you're planning on staying in your home all the way up into the point that maybe you need to be in a skilled nursing facility, which accepts Medicaid right away. But it really just depends on your situation. What you can do, though, is to try to do some research to figure out what options are available. Now, understanding Medicaid, the rules for Medicaid, which are different than the private pay rules, which are governed by the facility themselves, the state has certain rules for when you can be eligible for Medicaid. And mostly what they're looking at is you don't have enough assets to pay for your own care. And so the state is then stepping in, subsidizing that care, and making sure that you continue to get the care that you need. So for a single person, and this is the really shocking number, and I'm sorry for it, but your resources have to be below $2,000. For a married couple, the combined resources for assisted living and adult family home and in-home is about $70,000. And it can be higher if you're in a skilled nursing facility, but it's a bit more of a complicated formula for what it would be. There are certain exemptions. So those are the scary numbers at first. Your home is typically exempt. At least one vehicle is typically exempt. And then there are certain planning strategies that are, I would say, there are more planning strategies available for a married couple than there are for a single person. But there is always a way to think about how can you try to preserve as much of your assets as possible while also getting this assistance from the government, so that you don't become fully impoverished. So there are often at least something that we can do to try to hold on to some assets. When we're thinking about preserving assets, most people, the first thing that pops in their head, I'll give my money away. I'll give my money to my son. He'll take care of it for me, and I will be eligible for Medicaid. There is a 5-year look back period for Medicaid. So if you give away assets, you have to either, there's a formula for a transfer penalty period if you've given assets under a certain number. If it's over a certain number, then you have to wait out 5 years before you could potentially be eligible for Medicaid. And you're going to have to come up with those funds somehow to pay for your care and meet your expenses during that 5-year period. I also am typically not a fan of telling my clients, sure, give away all your assets to a family member and just relying on trust that they'll take care of it for you. You may have absolutely wonderful family or friends that you trust absolutely. As an attorney, I might be more cynical than most, but it concerns me for somebody to give up all legal rights to their assets, because you are giving up all access, all right to that money. You can't ask for it back once you give it away. And that makes me nervous, because I think it's typically in somebody's best interest to hold on to their money and use other planning options than to give away the funds and hope that maybe they're used for them, but not really have control over that. And that kind of leads us to watching out for misinformation, because you'll see a lot of things out there, do an irrevocable trust, transfer your assets. It's a easy money-making tool, unfortunately, for attorneys and others to give what appears to be a magic solution, which might be doing more of a favor to them as far as being able to charge for that magic solution than it really is to you. So you want to be a little bit wary. If something seems too good to be true, it probably is. However, there are options. There are ways to preserve assets. It just really is dependent upon your situation. And there's always going to be a little bit of give and take when it comes to Medicaid, because there's no way to just get something for absolutely nothing. However, we often can protect a lot more than what people think they can.
Great, thank you, Katie. And we'll have about 15 minutes for questions. Our last slide is really in summary. If you want to be proactive and take control of your aging journey based on all the information we shared with you, what are your next steps? What can you do to take control? And the first is do your legal planning. That's the absolute very first thing anyone should do with proactive planning, is do your power of attorney documents. Make a decision about who will be making those decisions for you when you're not able to. The second is financial planning. Meet with your financial advisor, or if you don't have a financial advisor, do a deep dive yourself. Understand your financial resources. Do you have loads of resources? Do you seem to have plenty? Or are you really concerned about how much money you have in relation to being able to afford care? Having that general sense is going to be crucial for your planning. The third step is to do care planning, similar to financial and legal planning. What will make the most sense for you? What are your preferences? Is it staying home, or should you consider moving? And that will be based on your preferences and your finances. People like myself, we're called care managers or aging life care professionals. This is exactly the kind of work we do, is we meet with people and talk through their preferences, their health issues, their finances, and help them develop a care plan that's realistic for their finances and sustainable. There's people, we're Aging Wisdom in Seattle, but there's people like us all over the country. We're part of a professional association. So if you're out of the area or you have family elsewhere, there are people that help with this planning all over. And the fourth is kind of building your team. Who is going to be your support team around you? It's often your attorney, your financial advisor, your aging life care professional, your doctor. Build that team so you have that safety net and then be able to talk with your family and friends and make sure they know that you've done this planning and what your planning is so they can jump in and implement those plans for you. Lastly, we have a slide about resources. So the Aging Life Care Association are care managers like myself. So there's a directory there for finding people like us. WALA is the Washington Elder Law Attorney Directory, where you find attorneys like Katie who can help with the legal planning. And then the last four organizations are nonprofit organizations in each of the counties represented today, that if finances are limited for you, these organizations provide great support for people, and you can look them up in your county and seek their guidance. So I think that is it for our slides. And Kara, I think you were gonna.
Yes, let's get into it. We've got a lot of great questions here, and thank you all for the upvotes and for the questions. This first one is, do beneficiaries listed on financial accounts supersede what is in the will or trust?
Yeah, so that sounds like one for me. The simple answer is yes, normally. In order for a will to supersede beneficiary designations, there has to be very specific language in the will that says it's superseding beneficiary designations. But otherwise, beneficiary designations pull something out of the control of a will. If you have an account that has a beneficiary designation that you've then put the account in the trust, normally the trust will control. It kind of depends on which one comes first or last. In general, and what that kind of comes to is there are probate assets and non-probate assets. And so non-probate assets are assets that are not going to be controlled by your will, are not going to be controlled by the laws of intestacy. They're not going to go through the court system with probate. It's actually controlled by a contract, which is a beneficiary designation, a payable on death designation for real property. It's a transfer on death deed, or on different assets, maybe joint with right of survivorship. Those are the different type of characterizations that pull it out from a will, out from a probate.
Thank you. Next question. Do you recommend a durable financial power of attorney that is immediately effective, or one that springs on one's disability?
So there's pros and cons for both. I think that most people's gut reaction is wanting it to spring upon disability, because they say, well, I don't want somebody making decisions while I still have the ability to make those decisions. And what I tell people, and sometimes it might surprise folks when I say, well, I actually recommend that it's effective immediately. And that's because if you're choosing an agent that you trust, I would hope that there's somebody who are not going to, when you say, I've appointed you as my power of attorney, but I don't need you to do anything, I would hope that there's somebody who's going to listen and respect those instructions from you. And most people don't become more trustworthy once you're unable to make decisions and are incapacitated. So if you don't trust them when you have full function over everything, then they probably just shouldn't be your agent. The other thing to think about is for two things, when you lose the ability to make decisions, for some folks, it's night and day. Maybe there's a stroke, and one day you are making full decisions for yourself, and the next you're not. And in that case, in that kind of crisis scenario, often you want your agent to be able to immediately jump in and provide assistance rather than chasing down a doctor and getting a letter stating that you're incapacitated to be able to step in and help you. Or two, the more likely situation is it's more kind of a slow step, trip, tumble into incapacity. And for a lot of folks, what you're looking for is starts out with kind of a partner, somebody who's making decisions along with you, that you're bouncing things off of, that's able to be kind of a reality check or helps you set things up or kind of go through paperwork, to somebody that you're slowly handing over more and more tasks that you're not wanting to do or not really able to do before you get fully to a place where you're unable to make decisions and they're fully in the driver's seat. And in that situation, you may want your power of attorney to be helping you and acting as a power of attorney before you're actually incapacitated and before a doctor would say you're incapacitated. So in both the situations, I think it's probably more effective to have the effective immediately designation.
Got it. Good. Next question. Can an attorney or financial advisor be the executor for your will if you don't want to burden a family member with the responsibility, or if you don't have someone to take it on?
So it just depends on whether that professional serves in that capacity. There are some attorneys that will serve as a PR, a personal representative, or an executor. Most attorneys don't. There are people who will hold themselves out as professional fiduciaries, who will serve in that role. And then they will almost always hire an attorney to assist them in making sure that they're performing the role correctly.
Got it. And if you do choose a family member to serve in that role, could they then outsource it to someone else if they didn't end up wanting to take it on?
Yeah, it depends on what you put in your documents. A lot of people will put in their documents, you know, my agent has the authority to hire a CPA, hire an attorney, hire care management, you know, choose a professional that's able to help them make the decisions and best serve you in that role.
Got it. Okay, next question. How often should you update your will?
It really depends. I tell people at least every 5 years, look at your own documents, make sure that they actually still do what you want them to do. The legal area of estate planning is slow moving. The laws don't change that often. Sometimes they do. Normally, the change in laws is not going to necessitate you updating your documents. Normally, what is actually motivating a change in your documents is your own, you know, you changing your mind as far as who you want your agent or your executor, where you want your money to go, whether, you know, are your kids still minors or they've grown up, so now the situation has changed in what you want to do. So you want to pay attention to your own documents, and when you see something that you're like, I actually would like to do something different, that's a good time to reach out and get an update.
Great. Speaking of wills, this is a related question a little bit further down, but similar. Can you just remind us all in Washington state what constitutes a legal will? Can it be handwritten or typed? And does it need to be witnessed or notarized?
So a will in Washington, we don't have handwritten wills. It does need to be typed and it needs to be witnessed. And then there's an attestation of the witnesses that is normally notarized.
Got it. Thank you. Some of these questions are pretty general. There's one here with a lot of upvotes, but I don't know if you'll want to answer this, and feel free to say no. More info about trust versus will. I mean, that sounds like a whole other webinar.
It is a whole another webinar. I don't think we have time for that today,
okay. Yes.
Unfortunately.
That's okay. That's okay. Let's see here. Can you add your children as a co-owner onto the deed of your home for them to be able to take it out of probate upon your death?
So a co-owner won't do that, but I mentioned a couple times that you can have either you can have a transfer on death deed, which that would take it out of probate and it would go directly to your beneficiary, which there's pros and cons of that, which, you know, I would definitely recommend discussing with your attorney.
Yes, and we do have another webinar in our history that someone did on the pros and cons of probate. So we have lots of resources available. Let me see here. Let's go here. I have my documents in place and I recently moved to a retirement community. Are there unique issues when you live in a retirement community, such as possessions, buy-in decision-making, etc., that require updating your documents?
Typically, no. So for your possessions, regardless of where they are, typically what your will or your trust will say is that, or your will typically will say this is where your tangible personal property will go. And oftentimes it's just with the residue of your estate, unless you have a handwritten, and this is the part that can be handwritten, is your list of where you want your personal possessions to go. And that you have to date it and sign it, and it's normally kept with your will. And that's something that your attorney, when you do your will, should discuss with you. But that wouldn't necessarily be different if you're a retirement home or not. For a buy-in, that's something that's going to be by contract when you move into the retirement facility. If you pass away at a certain point in living there, you're going to have a whole contract that says what happens, you know, if any money is going to come back to your beneficiaries if you pass away at a certain point. And so that contract is going to determine where that goes. And so that's not something normally that you have to update your will or anything like that.
Got it. Thank you. We've got a couple questions from people who are asking if they don't have the resources maybe to afford some of these services that we've mentioned. What kind of options are there for people who might not have finances to support themselves as they age?
Well, I mentioned the nonprofits in each county that most of them have a whole array of services they provide. They'll often have caregiver support services, some legal clinics, they problem solve about health insurance, and they also can do care connections with resources. So they're a great place to start for people to begin that problem solving.
Mm-hmm. And I know King County and probably other counties will often do like monthly or bi-monthly free clinics for estate planning or to meet with elder law attorneys. And I think probably in the links that Lisa provided will connect to those legal clinics.
Excellent. And just a reminder to everyone, we will be sharing this recording and we will be sharing those wonderful slides that you just saw. So you'll have time to go through this on your own and go back through and review. All right, let's keep going with these questions. Time for a few more here. Do you need an attorney to make a codicil to your will?
Technically, no. And obviously this is coming from an attorney, so I'm biased. But I do estate planning and I do probates and estate litigation. And it's very infrequently that I see estate planning that people do themselves that don't have issues in them. And it's one of those problems of you don't know what you don't know. And it's, you obviously can save money on the front end on doing your own documents. You just don't know how much money you might not be saving on the back end if there's issues, and then it ends up having to come into court to be resolved. So obviously my recommendation is going to be talk to your attorney, and that's a better safe than sorry recommendation, but obviously it's up to you as far as what what people decide is right for them.
Mm-hmm. Good. Let me see here. Oh, the questions just moved. How do you decide if long-term care is worth the investment?
And I'm assuming that's long-term care insurance.
Yes, there were several questions about long-term care insurance throughout here.
So what I would say about neither Katie nor I sell long-term care insurance, so I think we're fairly unbiased in that regard. Buying long-term care insurance is typically best done in your 50s. The older you are when you apply, the more expensive. These days, long-term care insurance policies are fairly astronomical. Many people are kind of priced out of the market of purchasing them. But I think another piece, you're usually buying like a length of time for a policy and how much you would get kind of each month or in totality. And people often think they'll have to have coverage for the entire amount of care when people can what if you had support for half the cost or a quarter of the cost? It might supplement your private pay resources. So it really depends on whether you can afford to private pay for the resources. I forgot to mention, I said 70% of people will need care. Statistically, they say 3 people will need care for 3 years, a little bit more, less for men, a little more for women. I think we see people needing care for a lot longer than that, but statistics show 3. So if you're doing some back of the envelope numbers of yourself, deciding do you have the resources to pay for this care? And if not, you'll have to find ways to supplement, and long-term care insurance might be a great resource. Most long-term care insurance agents, and Katie and I are happy to make referrals, are very helpful resource. They'll help you problem solve your unique situation and usually be quite honest with people. So it would be probably worth talking with an agent.
Good.
Yeah,
Thank
and I
you.
think something to think about with long-term care insurance is really where they pay out and how they pay out. Because if your long-term care insurance only pays out if you're in assisted living community, but you don't plan on going to an assisted living community, it's not going to do you a lot of good. A lot of people are surprised, when they go into an adult family home and their contract doesn't necessarily automatically apply because the adult family home isn't included in the contract. So it's really important to be intimately educated on what your contract actually means to make sure that's going to serve you.
Got it. Well, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague from King County Library System Foundation, Jessica. And thank you again, Katie and Lisa. Thank you everyone for coming. And Jessica, you can take it away.
Thank you, Kara. My name is Jessica Carso, and I am the Director of Donor Relations at the King County Library System Foundation. Thank you again very, very much to Lisa and Katie. This is a labor of love that we ask our facilitators and presenters to do for us, and so we really do appreciate it. We know that we also can't get through all the questions that come in, but we do promise, as a reminder, and Kara mentioned it as well, that we will be sending up follow-up email that will include these slides. They will include the presentation itself, and we will also make sure that you have links so you can get to the past presentations as well. There are a few years worth on the YouTube site. Just a quick reminder too to everybody that in our state of the world, in this region, in the Seattle region, we've got Give Big coming up. That is on May 7th and 8th. And you can show your favorite nonprofits, and we hope that means your libraries, some love by donating to Give Big. Just Google Give Big if you're not familiar, and you'll find all the information. It is also obviously on your library foundation websites. And finally, if you are planning, and we certainly hope that you are, to make a charitable request to your libraries, to your library foundations, and you want to let us know, we would love that because it would make sure that we can properly thank you and acknowledge you, and also make sure that your information is properly documented so that it goes into the right places at the right times. Also, we realize that we can't get through all the questions and comments that come through. So if you want to reach out to us, please feel free to do that. At the end of the slideshow, you will see our contact information. Very importantly, your voice matters. It is truly the reason why we continue, number one, to do these, but also that we do them in a way that is important to you all. So we're listening to you and we're trying to deliver. Right after we drop off in mere seconds, you will be directed to a survey. Please take just a moment to fill that out for us. We do take that information very seriously. And then if you do participate, we do a drawing for a wonderful bag of books. So there's something in it for everybody. Thank you so, so very much. And you'll hear from us in a few days.
Thank
Bye,
you all.
everybody.
Thank you, Lisa and Katie.